Hello and welcome to the topic, What is Science? In this lesson, we're going to learn about what is science inquiry. Now, in this topic of what is science, we're going to talk about a big idea. And that big idea is how can science answer questions about the world around you? Specifically in this lesson, what we're going to look at is 1, what is scientific inquiry? Number 2, what are the results of a scientific investigation? And number 3, what is critical thinking? So as always, let's start with some key vocabulary. And the first word is, of course, science. Science is the investigation and exploration of natural events and of new information that results from these investigations or experiments. Observation is using one or more of your senses, and then you use that to gather information and take notes about what happens or what occurs. You also, in an experiment, make inference. Inference would be a logical explanation of what you're observing, and it's drawing from your prior knowledge and your own experience to make that logical explanation. You also have hypothesis. Hypothesis is a possible explanation about an observation that can be tested by scientific investigations or experiments. So you're going to write the hypothesis and then you're going to test the hypothesis. And a prediction is a statement of what is going to happen next in a sequence of events. So number 1, number 2, number 3. So you're saying, I think number 1 will be this, number 2 will be this, and number 3 will be this. Scientific theory is an explanation of events based on knowledge gained from observations or experiments. So a scientific theory has not been proven, but it does have some evidence to back it up. Now you have also a scientific law. Now we're going to compare theory and law a little bit later. But a scientific law is a rule that describes something that happens again and again in nature. It describes a pattern in nature. Now, it will always have been proven and it's based on facts. And our final vocabulary word is critical thinking. And that's basically taking what you already know and comparing that with information that you have been given and deciding whether you agree or change your mind based on that. We call that critical thinking. It's about taking in new knowledge and putting it in with what you already know. So let's go ahead and begin the lesson. Now, as we said, science is the investigation and exploration of natural events and of new information. Now, the main part of science, the main reason behind science is to solve problems. So they use, reasoning, creativity, and skepticism. Skepticism means not really believing what you see until you can prove it. So it's called being skeptical. So it's wanting facts and to prove something. And we use all of these skills to solve problems. And that's what science is about. Now you have 3 big areas of science that we're going to study over the course of these lessons. And the first one is life science, or some people call it biology. The second is earth science, and the third is physical science. All 3 of these we call integrated sciences. So life sciences studies living things. Earth sciences, of course, studies the earth and rocks and soil. And physical science has to do with chemistry and physics. Now, scientists, as they study, they have a very specific method that they use for scientific inquiry. It's a series of steps that they go through in order to do their experiment or investigation, and they follow this sequence. Now, this sequence starts out with asking a question, all right? They make an observation or they state a problem, and then from there, they write their hypothesis, right? What they think is going to happen when they do their experiments. Then they test their hypothesis. That means they're going to design an experiment to kind of answer that original question from step one. Then they conduct the experiment, and then they look at their results. What happened in the experiment? Now, if they find out that yes, the hypothesis that they did in stage 2 was supported and true, then what they do is they go back and they repeat the experiment again. You want to do the experiment again and again because the goal is to make sure you have the same results in stage 4. All right? Now, if the first time you do the experiment and your hypothesis was not supported, then what you do is you go back and you, in stage 2, rewrite your hypothesis. You make another prediction, also based on the information you have from your first experiment. So you've done your multiple experiments and they've all turned out to be supported and it's all good. So now what you're going to do is take all that, because the experiment has been successful, and then you're going to draw some conclusions. You're going to infer and say, well, because of this, this is true. All right? So that's what you do. And then the final stage is something your teacher will probably tell you to do, is you have to communicate your results. You're going to have to communicate them to your class, or maybe the teacher gave you a science experiment worksheet because she told you what experiment to do, or maybe she has you keeping a scientific journal. Somewhere you should document and communicate the results of this whole process that you just went through. So again, remember that an observation is using your senses to gather information and take notes of what happens. A prediction is a statement of what will happen next in a sequence of events. You are guessing as to what comes next. That is what a prediction is. But it's an educated guess. It's not just any guess. You then test your hypothesis or your statement with an experiment. And what you want to do is collect information and make observations as to what's happening. And then after this, you analyze the results. And remember that an inference is a logical explanation of an observation. The key word being logical. It must make sense. So when you make that inference or that guess, it has to be an educated guess, a logical guess of what you did. And when you do that inference, you're kind of drawing on prior knowledge and combining that with what you just learned. And then any good scientist will repeat his experiments again and again. And if your hypothesis is not good, you simply rewrite it or modify it. And then you go through the process again and again. Now, when you are testing your predictions, you have to make sure it is confirmed or not confirmed. Again, that hypothesis is supported or not supported. Remember that you have to revise your hypothesis and you may have to revise your experiment. And then finally is to draw a conclusion, to make a summary of all the information you gained from all this that you did. And then finally to communicate, to tell someone the results of your scientific investigation or experiment. So now we're at a key concept. And that is what we talked about earlier when I said this is one of the 3 things we're going to learn. And that is, what is scientific inquiry? Well, Scientific inquiry, remember, is to ask for information or to investigate something. And the goal is to find out more. So it is using the evidence from your observations and your experiments to create explanations and to answer questions. That's what scientific inquiry is. You're going to ask for information. You're going to investigate something. Your goal is to find out more information, right? And then from all that information from the experiments, you are going to create explanations and answer questions. So remember that when you do a science experiment, I'm going to go over this one more time, because we want to know that scientific experiments answer questions like who, what, when, where, or how. So you always start out with ask a question. And then you want to do some background research about your question, right? So what is the problem? For example, the question would be, why does water freeze at a certain temperature? And then do some background research. Now, that's a very simple one that a lot of people have proven, but it can be anything. What will happen if I pour Coca-Cola into Pepsi? Anything. Then you're going to create an experiment, all right? And the goal of this experiment is to answer that question. So then you say, is my procedure working? Is my experiment working? Is it proving my hypothesis? Yes or no? If no, well then don't worry. Carefully check all the steps and redo it, or redo your hypothesis. If yes, then remember, after doing the experiment a couple times, then you analyze your data and draw some conclusions. And then after you analyze all that information, now if the results are aligned with the hypothesis, then you communicate. If they are not, then you go back up and redo your hypothesis. So, another key concept check. What are the results of a scientific investigation? What do we learn of scientific investigation or experiment? Aside from answering our question and hypothesis, scientific investigations answer questions such as who, what, where, or how. Now let's talk about scientific theory. Remember I mentioned scientific theory and scientific law? Remember that a scientific theory is an explanation based on events. Now, it does not develop from just one hypothesis. It's usually many different questions or hypotheses put together. And it's gained by knowledge or investigations. An example would be the Big Bang theory about how our universe started. The other one would be what we call continental drift, how our continents drifted apart, and basically the Earth's crust. Now, a scientific law is a rule, and that describes, again, the goal here is a repeatable pattern in nature. It happens again and again and again. So it does not explain the why or the how. It only states exactly what is going to happen. And a good example of this is gravity. It happens again and again. We don't know why, but we do know what's going to happen. Now, there are many different theories and laws, etc., and you don't have to know them all right now. For example, there's kinetic molecular theory, there's the law of conservation of energy. You're going to go through a lot of them as you learn your science. The one thing to remember is I want you to know the difference between the two. So let's go ahead and do a little bit of highlighting. So a scientific theory is based on repeated observations or investigations, all right, or experiments, whereas scientific laws are something that is observed repeatedly again and again in nature. Now, if new information does not support it, right? It is modified or rejected. The scientific theory will change. Now, if in scientific law, if the observations do not follow the law, then the law is rejected. It's not modified, like a scientific theory can be modified. If they observe something different, then the law is no longer valid. It's no longer a rule. Now, scientific theory attempts to explain why something happens, whereas the scientific law simply states that something will happen. It doesn't look at the why, it just says this will happen because this is the scientific law about that. Now, scientific theories are also usually more complex. They're taking a bunch of different hypotheses and trying to explain why, etc. Whereas scientific law usually contains only one very well supported hypothesis. You know exactly what's going to happen. It explains it. So, now that we've done that, let's look at our last key concept check, and that is, how are scientific law and scientific theory different? Well, remember what I said. Scientific theory is an explanation, and it's from multiple investigations, experiments, and observations. Scientific law is a rule, and it describes a repeatable pattern in nature. Now, the other thing to remember is that a scientific theory has many hypotheses, whereas a scientific law only has one hypothesis. In addition, a scientific law does not explain why or how, though a scientific theory may explain the why, or attempt to explain the why. Now, whenever we read or watch TV, etc., we're always getting this information and people's opinions, what they think. It's all coming at us. And then what we do is when we get this information, then we start looking at it and saying, what do I already know? What do I believe? And what is this new information? And then we compare all this in order to decide whether we agree with it or not. So that's what critical thinking is. It's about taking all this information and saying, do I agree with this? What I've heard and what I know, do I think that's correct? Now, we use critical thinking when we're doing science experiments. That's obvious. We always want to do that. But we have to remember that there are some things that we should do during our scientific experiment. And the first one is called sampling. Sampling means we don't have to have a large amount of something to test, right? We can just take little samples of it to test. All right? Number two is called bias. That means don't let your personal feelings get involved in the experiment. Don't say what you think wants to happen or what you want to happen and then use that to control the experiment. We should all be fair and neutral and just let information come to us that's true. Now, you also have something in science called a blind study. A blind study is where it reduces bias. It means that we're not having, our favorite. For example, like a taste test. You're trying 3 different types of ice cream, and they're all chocolate, and someone says, which one is the best? Now, they're not going to show you the name because maybe you really, really like Haagen-Dazs ice cream. So a blind study means they hide the names. So there's no bias. There's no feelings involved. It's only fact. Which one is best? And then the other one is repetition. Remember, we talked about this. Do it again and again. So that blind taste test of chocolate ice cream. Repeat the same test again and again, either with the same people or different people, and then look at the results you get. How many people said Haagen-Dazs is better? How many people says Nestle is better? Now understand that when we look at science, the one thing we have to understand is that science does not answer things involved around personal opinions or our beliefs or what we feel. For example, religion. Questions about religion can't be answered by science. Also remember, always follow safety procedures in the lab when you're conducting an experiment. Follow your teacher's instructions. That's very important. And always remember ethics if you ever find yourself experimenting with living things, animals or plants. So now we're to our last key concept check. What is critical thinking? All right, critical thinking, again, remember, it is comparing what you already know with new information you are given, and then you're using that to decide whether you agree with it or not. So again, critical thinking is taking what you already know, new information, putting them together and deciding, do I agree? Do I believe? So in summary, remember that scientific inquiry is a series of steps in order to do a scientific investigation or experiment. And understand that there are many results of scientific inquiry, and the main result of science is to help us solve problems. And science is all about the discovery of new technology and new materials and new ways to solve our problems. And then finally, critical thinking is taking your current information and knowledge, new information and knowledge, putting it together and deciding what you believe. Congratulations, you have successfully completed the lesson on what is science inquiry. I hope you enjoyed the lesson and stay tuned for the next one. Thank you.